Today's episode is sponsored by Rev, the productivity powerhouse for content creators, journalists, market researchers, and more. Capture audio from anywhere, get AI-powered summaries and quotes, and leave security worries behind with Rev. Whether you're on the go or in the office, Rev's got you covered. Discover more at rev.com. I'm Kendall Kelton, and I'm your host today on The Rough Draft. Featuring honest conversations with folks from across the creative industry, The Rough Draft explores the creative process, tools, and resources used by some of the best in the business. From journalists to content creators and business leaders, we shed light on what it looks like to break into the industry, make mistakes, collaborate with others, and also the essential tools that help us along the way. This week, I'm super excited to be talking with Daniel Parris, the brain behind the popular newsletter Stat Significant. Daniel's got a unique gig. He's a data scientist who blends numbers with pop culture. So if you've ever wondered about the statistical side of why you can't stop watching true crime documentaries or what makes Star Wars fans so dedicated, Daniel's your guy. And on today's episode, he walks us through how he created one of his favorite essays to date, Why Do People Hate Nickelback So Much? A statistical analysis. So you wrote an essay, Why Do People Hate Nickelback So Much? And people absorbed it like I did. And you kicked it off with how does one explain Nickelback and how does one explain the band's remarkable second life as a meme? So I want to ask you to walk us through why Nickelback? What were you doing on some sunny day in California, walking around and all of a sudden thinking about Nickelback?
Yeah, I was talking with my friends and Nickelback came up, and I think it's like one of those sort of picture perfect moments that you see in a movie where someone says the thing and then in the next scene they're doing the thing that they said, where I think I said something like, it'd be cool if you could quantify how terrible they are. And then I went home and was like, can I quantify how terrible they are? And for the record, I actually am very lukewarm on Nickelback. I like some of their songs. I think some of the complaints are valid. I don't have a super strong belief that they're undeserving of the attention that they get. So basically, it came out of a conversation with friends, and I was like, okay, if I can find 2 or 3 valid reasons why people dislike this band, then yeah, I'll definitely write this article.
Well, you laid out 4 hypotheses in your essay about this. So I'd like to kind of break those down a bit. So starting with the idea that they're overplayed, what data did you pull to back what they really are in the public eye?
Yeah, so I think the thing about Nickelback, their sort of chief complaint against them is that all of their songs sound the same, right? But what's interesting is if you had a band that was maybe not as heavily played and all their songs sound the same, people wouldn't be angry about it. I think what's angry is that they're a fairly heavily exposed band in the sense that they actually have a lot of hit songs and they're one of the best selling bands of all time. At the same time, I wanted to figure out, can I also then quantify whether their songs are fairly similar? So ultimately, I basically graphed both record sales against a bunch of different Spotify variables, an amalgamation of Spotify variables. And so I basically said, okay, let's look at the variance of Nickelback's song composition versus the amount of sales that they have. And ultimately what I found is they're actually pretty unique in the fact that their songs are quite low variance when you look at all of these different aspects of song composition. And given that low variability, they're also extremely high selling. So they were one of the main 2 or 3 outliers that is low variability, high record sales, right? And so what you get is people are listening to a lot of songs that actually quantifiably do sound pretty similar.
Well, and it was interesting. I guess if you would have asked me a while ago if I would have associated Nickelback with having country genre influence, I would have been no. And then I read your article and I was like, oh, that actually kind of makes sense. And they were falling into that category alongside a lot of country artists.
Yes. I think the other artist that was most similar to them was Toby Keith, who's an American country star. That was something that I hadn't previously thought of. And I actually found other data subsequent to that view that really like framed it as like they are kind of reminiscent of a country band. I think they often are called like a post-grunge alternative country mashup. So they're actually like a lot of different micro genres like put together in this one band.
Well, and then the other interesting thing, and I think a lot of people associate this with the country genre, is that sometimes they get put in this box of it's just the same song on repeat over and over and over again. And I think you found that also, and within one of your hypotheses for this, there was like an interesting an interesting quote of somebody who was saying they have 89 songs, but essentially it's the same 3 songs over and over and over again.
Yeah, I think I quoted a music journalist who, you know, like many people on the internet, just, you know, took their shot at Nickelback.
Yeah. But you also mentioned that socio-political factors might play a role also in it, which was really interesting.
I didn't go into it being like, I see the world and, you know, right and left, but I was like, okay, you probably have music critics who are mostly left leaning. And so I was like, why? One of the cuts that I looked at earlier was basically like sales versus critical acclaim. So I looked at like Metacritic reviews for Nickelback, and then I also looked at sales. And they were also an outlier in the fact that their albums received quite low scores from music critics, but they obviously have a lot of sales. And so my question was like, okay, who's listening to these albums, right? And it wasn't like in a disdainful way. It was like, I imagine that there's probably like a different slant for the people who are writing music criticism.
Well, they're obviously doing well to some degree, so who is listening to them?
Yeah, and I actually found it not on purpose. What happened is I was looking at Google Trends, and I typed in Nickelback, and I noticed that when the United States search map came up, that Nickelback was mostly showing up in states that you associate as like right-leaning. And so what I did is I took 2020 presidential election results, and then I looked at the correlation between how often the band is searched in that state and then like what the voter percentage was for the GOP presidential candidate. And I found that there was actually quite a strong correlation. And so in the article, you can see there's like a nice regression line. And so what I found is that the band is more likely to be listened to in right-leaning states. And so that's not to say that like that is a reason that they are bad, but I think what that answered for me was, okay, there's some divide.
It segues nicely into the idea of them just being a victim of bad publicity, right? They had a few like really unfortunate like series of events that happened.
This is the one that like blew my mind. This was the one where when I like first heard about this, I was like, this can't be right. So basically what happened is that there's this random stand-up show on Comedy Central where a bunch of comedians sat around and talked about current events. And this one comedian made just an offhand quip where he was like, oh, I hate Nickelback's music. If I had a gun, I'd shoot Nickelback. And everyone's like, ha, ha, ha. And then they clipped that, and then they made it a cornerstone of the advertising campaign for that show. And apparently that ad ran for quite some time, like 6 months to a year. And so I basically like did a sort of like McKinsey-esque sizing of like how many times was that joke repeated. And I forget like the actual amount that I was able to size, but it was like, oh yeah, it was like, I think it was like billions of times. But then I found this quote from Nickelback's frontman, his name's Chad Kroeger, where he basically points to that as like the genesis of Nickelback hatred.
And so many people were watching TV at that point. So everyone saw the ad, right?
And this is also Comedy Central in their heyday. I think you had like South Park, Chappelle Show. And then the other thing that I found where they were sort of on they were the beneficiary of bad luck is kind of how I put it, was that they were slated to perform a halftime show for the NFL Thanksgiving game in Detroit. Yeah. And the city of Detroit wrote a petition saying like, this is the city of Motown. Like, why is Nickelback playing our halftime show? And the petition got like nearly 60,000 signatures. And so what I ended up finding is that if you look at Google searches for Nickelback hate, just the term Nickelback hate, which gets like a decent amount of Google traffic, it didn't come into being until this very specific time. So basically, like, just from a pure search perspective, like, people searching and seeking out the Nickelback meme didn't seem to be as much of a thing before this NFL halftime show. And then maybe just to add insult to injury, you can watch a video of the halftime show and people are actively booing them as they perform. An interesting aspect of all of this is that I think now the band cites the Nickelback meme as a reason for their longevity. Like, the fact that they are still relevant is now like a function of the Nickelback meme. You know, you have like bands like Three Doors Down, and I'm honestly going to exhaust my understanding of like post-grunge bands. But, you know, if you had a thought experiment, it's like, why is Three Doors Down not relevant? Nickelback is. Like, they're very comparable bands, probably have the same number of hits. And it's because Nickelback has had this second life as like an internet meme. And that's also galvanized their fans. And so it's actually been this phenomenon that, I mean, it's probably not great to be Nickelback on the receiving end of all that hatred, but there has been some like benefit to this whole, to the meme and the relevancy.
Would you take a minute to kind of tell people where they can read your essays, and then we'll link to it also in the show notes?
Yeah. So you can read the essays at statsignificant.com, all one word, obviously. And then, it's the Stat Significant newsletter on Substack. I post it once a week on Wednesdays. And if you like pop culture and you like thinking pop culture in a slightly different way, subscribe.
Well, that's it for today's episode of The Rough Draft. Be sure to rate and subscribe in order to stay up to date with the latest episodes, and visit rev.com/podcasts for even more content. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to seeing you again on the next episode of The Rough Draft.